But they should be saying, when we get this under control, we're not just going to walk away from our responsibilities. It should be a generic route. That is where the government has fallen down. I'm not saying they should open it immediately because we have so much irregular movement at the moment.
Hello and welcome to Marshall Matters with me, Winston Marshall at The Spectator. Well, I've been exploring taboo topics, and one of those topics that will surefire get you called a bigot, far right, hard right, racist, and apparently this week also a homophobe is the issue of immigration. And Suella Braverman has just done a speech in America which has captured the imagination and the ire of the nation. And so to discuss it and discuss the state of immigration in the UK, I have the pleasure of speaking with author of the books The British Dream, Success and Failures of Post-War Immigration, which celebrates its 10-year anniversary this year. Head, Hand, Heart, the Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century, and the absolutely superb and seminal The Road to Somewhere, The Populist Revolt and the Future of Politics. It is, of course, David Goodhart. David, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for the invitation, Winston.
I'm normally sort of try and ease my guests into it, but I thought I'd start with a tough question for you. How is the amateur a cappella group going?
Well, I'm hoping to form one with you as the Meister.
Yeah.
In the next few weeks. I've been in a couple of singing groups in my time, and I'm looking to form a new one. And you're a musician, and you enjoy singing, so. Yeah. A cappella, by the way, can mean pretty well anything these days. I mean, just a whole lot of people getting together and singing, men and women, instruments or not.
Have you got an idea of the repertoire you want us to be?
Kind of anything really, pop music.
So it really seems like you've given this a lot of thought. Every time I bump into you, you mention that you want to start this group. But now that I'm pressing you on it, it seems like it's maybe not something that you're so serious about. But anyway, that's maybe something for another time. So I want to talk about Suella's speech, and in which she says that illegal immigration and immigration is an existential threat to the West. Do you think that she is correct with this year 1 million net migrants forecast to arrive in the UK? In 2022, 330,000 illegal immigrants into the EU, 2.6 million illegal immigrants into the US, and 45,000 illegal immigrants into the UK. Is illegal immigration an existential threat to the West?
Existential threat. So it's a little bit hyperbolic, but it's a massive issue, and it's a massive issue partly because it divides electorates, and it divides the voters in liberal Western democracies. Not quite down the middle. Probably in most countries, 2/3 or 3/4 of people probably think that certainly in the high immigration countries like Britain, France, Germany. That immigration is too high, that society is changing too fast, but the kind of most influential quarter or a third of the population either don't go along with that or feel that the cost of restricting immigration, both legal and illegal asylum refugee immigration, is too high. As the numbers have risen again this year, we're not yet back to anything like the level in Europe that we had in 2015 after Syria, but the numbers are creeping back up. And, we've had this dramatic episode in Lampedusa, the Italian island in the Mediterranean, where 11,000 Africans just arrived, was it last week? And the significance of that is not only the fact that 11,000 people arriving in Lampedusa is larger than the population of Lampedusa itself, which I think is about 6,000 or 7,000, caused a huge crisis in Italian politics. Ursula von Leyen, the EU leader, turned up to give her support to Meloni. Curiously enough, a little sort of in parentheses, it's created a sort of division within the new right in Europe between Marine Le Pen and Meloni as to how one should try and combat this issue. Marine Le Pen has basically given up on the EU. She says the EU is just immigrationist, whereas Meloni is still hoping for support. But the real significance, in a way, I think, of the Lampedusa episode is that it shows just how difficult it is going to be. Not impossible, but just how difficult it's going to be to restrict movement across the Mediterranean from North Africa, because the EU had just signed a deal with Tunisia, which is where the people were coming from. I think eventually it was going to pay out about €500 million or €1 billion. I think they'd formally agreed €100 million precisely to stop this kind of movement. And yet it happened like weeks after they had signed this agreement. I mean, this could be a clever negotiating move on the part of the Tunisian government to emphasize what an important gateway they are, and how important it is to perhaps pay them €2 billion rather than €1 billion. Who knows? But I mean, across Europe, obviously, the numbers have been going up quite sharply, and the sense that democratic governments are left kind of wringing their hands because of the way, I mean, this applies in the UK as much, if not more than anywhere else, that the liberalisation of the rules that govern the movement of refugees and asylum seekers basically makes it very difficult to stop people coming. Once they're here, it makes it very, very difficult to deport them. Hence, our government has taken a different track. Because of the embarrassment of having 45,000 people a year coming across the channel. I mean, it's just partly the visibility of it. I mean, when 45,000 people are coming on lorries or through overstaying visas, it doesn't become such a big political issue. But when you have that challenge to the common sense citizens' idea that, we belong to a nation state. One of the definitions of a nation state is it has borders. One of the definitions of democratic government is that you control those borders. And when you have the inability to do that kind of being rubbed in our faces every day, it does cause great unease, and it has led to our government taking what seems to many people, even people who support what their broad intention is, the slightly eccentric idea of sending people to an African state that most people remember as the site of a terrible genocide within living memory.
Rwanda, yeah.
Rwanda.
David, you mentioned the Tunisia pact preceding the Lampedusa situation. Similar things happened where the Conservative government, since 2018, when the Stop the Boats sort of pledge began, there was the UK-France Joint Action Plan, January 2019, first UK-France Joint Statement in November 2020, second UK-France Joint Statement July 21, the Nationality and Borders Act, April 2022, first scheduled Rwanda flight in June 2022, third UK-France Joint Statement, November 22, the promise to stop the boats in January 2023, and the Illegal Migration Act this year. And in that time, we've had 108,000 illegal immigrants. Like all of these pacts and deals, it seems like nothing's actually being done. Firstly, has the Conservative government just completely messed up this entire thing? Has it? Well,
it's faced with a very difficult situation. It's faced with a kind of a legal structure and also a sort of semi-dysfunctional Home Office. And to be fair to it, it has come up with this idea, this Rwanda idea, which obviously immensely controversial, although it gets support from a majority of people in Britain. It is now being looked at by other European countries, and things are definitely shifting in Europe. You have the.
Do you support the Rwanda deal?
Well,
do you like it?
I support the principle behind it. I think there's nothing wrong with saying you cannot come to the country of your choice if you are in danger, you are suffering persecution, then you need to be in safety. You don't need to be in safety in Shepherd's Bush. And, if you're coming here, we can decide where the safe place is. I mean, in the longer run, I've actually just written a piece for the think tank that I work at, Part-Time Policy Exchange, on safe and legal routes. I mean, we basically need to turn around the whole assumptions refugee and asylum needs to become like legal immigration. We basically decide who comes here. That is much, much fairer than the current free-for-all. As everybody emphasises, 70-80% of people who come across the channel are fit young men. You have to be a fit young man to survive the journey often. And you have to come from a relatively well-off family. We're talking about the middle class in poor countries, basically. People who can afford $5,000 or $10,000 to get themselves...
Male as well.
Male.
Yeah.
And that is a survival of the fittest Darwinian system. I mean, it's sort of peculiar in some ways that people on the left are supporting the system. People on the left should be supporting a regulated, controlled system in which Western governments choose people from UNHCR camps or UNHCR registers, as indeed we did in the Syria refugee regime. Back between 2015 and 2020, we took in not about that many, it was about 20,000 people over 5 or 6 years, but it worked really well.
And they were placed in specific communities around the country.
And yes, and we had a really, a proper relationship between central government and local authorities, and it's all worked extremely well.
That was community sponsorship?
That was essentially organised by the national or local state here. Okay. But actually, one of the things I'm proposing is that, yes, by the way, we have something the government rightly emphasises, we have actually taken about 500,000 people since 2015 through safe and legal routes. Obviously, the big majority being the Ukrainians in the last year and a half.
And Hong Kongers.
The Hong Kongers. We also had an Afghan scheme and this Syria scheme and some tiddly little schemes as well.
Let's talk about the safe and legal routes, because this is something that gets a lot of pushback. As you mentioned, I think we've had 180,000 Ukrainians, 140,000 Hong Kongers. And the safe and legal routes are the UK resettlement scheme, community sponsorship and mandate scheme, which, as far as I can find out, there was 904 people.
Yeah, tiny, yeah, exactly.
In the year ending June. So that's absolutely tiny. So then you have the refugee family reunion visas, which is another way in. But apart from that, you can't even get, you wouldn't be able to get on a flight here. So what are those real? Do you think that there's enough being done for safe and legal routes to get to the UK?
I mean, I think it's a sort of a matter of timing and alignment. I mean, I think it's perfectly understandable that the government is not doing this at the moment when so many people are coming through illegal routes, irregular routes. So I think you need to have that under control before you start opening up these safe and legal routes. But you can start talking about them now. I mean, I think one of the failures with the government presentation on this is that they're open to the accusation that has come constantly from the refugee organisations that, it's all very well to talk about the 500,000 safe and legal routes, but those are all country specific. There is no generic safe and legal route for a Christian in Pakistan who faces persecution, a gay person in Iran who faces persecution or whatever. That is what they say, and it is a reasonable point. And the government should say, when we get the irregular entry, this unfair, free-for-all irregular entry under control, we will have a system that we will decide every year what the cap should be, and that'll depend on other flows and so on. But, we'll have a cap of 20,000, 30,000 a year. We will do our bit for the global refugee problem, and we will have a system like the Syria scheme, where we get the UNHCR, or we could have our own people out there collaborating with the UNHCR, as Canada does, to select people, and then you can select the people who are most in danger, who are most threatened by the Taliban or whatever, or who are most vulnerable, who have the most the most difficult medical conditions or whatever, and it'll mainly be women and children.
Well, in some ways, this what the Afghan, Ukrainian, and Hong Konger schemes is a version of that, is being specifically targeting groups, but that still hasn't appeased the opponents of...
Well, as I say, because they say there isn't a generic route. It's all very well, you have these specific country regimes, but what if you are, a Christian?
So you don't
in
think there
Pakistan
should be a generic route?
Yes, I'm saying there should be a generic route. That is where the government has fallen down. I'm not saying they should open it immediately, because we have so much irregular movement at the moment, but they should be talking about it. When they make speeches, And Jenrick, I think, has mentioned it in a couple of his speeches. But they should be saying, when we get this under control, we're not just going to walk away from our responsibilities. We have, we're a big, liberal, globally outward-looking country and all that. We need to do our part, and this is what we are planning to do. So we're going to have a generic, safe and legal route that we will go and select people from the UNHCR register, and we'll select the most vulnerable, and we'll bring in 20, 30,000 a year or whatever it is. I also propose that we should have, for those, there is a small number of people who really are in immediate danger. Obviously, very few people who are coming from northern France into Britain, they're not in immediate danger.
Very few or none.
But there are people who face, there was a famous Christian woman in Pakistan a few years ago who was prosecuted for blasphemy, and she was going to be executed. And there was an attempt to get her out by Sajid Javid, I think. In the end, she went to Canada, which she was. But, there's a very small number of people who are in absolute desperate straits like that. And there perhaps ought to be some sort of special red route for them, that you could have a kind of ad hoc committee of the security services and the Foreign Office and local ambassadors and so on. But that would always be, I think, a pretty small number. You're talking more about these millions of people who have been displaced because of conflict, who are living either in different parts of their own country or in a neighbouring country, and some of them some of them really would benefit from coming to a Western country. Many of them can be better helped where they are. Mm-hmm. That is also a point that's often forgotten.
Syrian strategy as well.
Yeah. And there was a very good book a few years ago. I forget the authors now, but in which they talked about the importance of making refugee camps sort of tolerable places where not only do they have health clinics and schools and so on, but places where people can actually work, where people can actually sort of create a life, and also they then remain quite close to their country of origin. They understand what the position is. If the conflict has died down, perhaps they can go home and so on. Rather than this assumption that as soon as somebody faces a difficulty in a faraway country, they should be coming to live in Stockport. It's unfair. It creates an unbalanced world. We need these places need to develop, and they're often losing their brightest and most energetic and ambitious people. They're the people who are on the boats crossing the channel. So we need a generic safe and legal route as well as the country-specific ones. Once we've got irregular movement more under control. But we also, the other big development, so one recent model is the Syria scheme that we had between 2015 and 2020, a generic version of that. The other thing that we've had, of course, is as you mentioned, is the Homes for Ukraine scheme, which was 120,000 British people accepted into their home, Ukrainians. Now, admittedly, it was dramatic. We were, these are people, who are kind of like us to some extent. They're live within the kind of broad European space. And we were seeing that they were being bombed out of their homes every night on television. So there was a huge amount of sympathy. Those things don't necessarily apply to most of the world's refugees. But what it did show is that the sort of skepticism, I think, of kind of Whitehall officials that ordinary British people can actually step up and look after refugees for a year or two. Their skepticism, I think, was proven wrong. And we should really tap into that, because I think the anxieties people have about particularly irregular immigration, people generally think that the kind of relaxed view about immigration that we had after post-Brexit, the feeling that that free movement had ended and anxiety about immigration did decline quite substantially. It popped right back up again, partly because legal migration is now at such an extraordinarily high level, 600,000 net a year. And of course, we have the boats, which is this sort of constant aggravating factor, which reminds people that our governments are impotent when it comes to controlling our our borders.
Before Brexit, I think it hit 330,000 net migration. Was the maximum legal migrants into the UK. Well, now we're at like 600, hitting 1 million.
We're not hitting 1 million. No, I mean that's wrong. I mean it's going to come down, not up. Net migration is up.
Why is it coming down?
Perhaps shall we come back to legal migration a bit later?
Okay.
I can't. We were talking about homes to Ukraine. So notwithstanding the fact that there is much greater anxiety about immigration in general, I think there are particular anxieties that people have about irregular migration. One is the enormous cost. Now, you might say that's partly government/Home Office incompetence, the fact that we've allowed this huge backlog to develop with the £8 million a day in hotels, £4 billion in general last year. But cost, integration issues and security issues. When someone is coming on a boat, it's much harder to sort of screen them in case they have connections to unsavory organisations or whatever. Now, the Homes for Ukraine scheme has sort of set a new template in a way for the way in which we could accommodate refugees. So if we, assuming a new system under which we're selecting most refugees, a la Syria scheme, then when they come here, instead of sitting in hotels, they are distributed around the country by people of goodwill. There are lots of people who are very, very pro-refugee. Well, let them, put their money where their mouth is. Let them step up, as many of them did in the case of Ukraine, and say, we will take. Not necessarily living in their homes, but we will help them. We will, help them with, English conversation classes or whatever. Tap into that goodwill that is out there. So that helps to reduce the cost. And also, the other factor is that the government should be looking to diaspora organisations. Why is the British Afghan Council or the British Iranian Association, why are these organisations not being asked to step up in the way that people did with Ukrainians? They're co-nationals who are coming here. We could say, Iran is a pretty dreadful theocratic state. Quite a few people coming across the channel are Iranian doctors who don't want to live in a theocratic state. Well, we could say we will take 2,000. They have to obviously be outside the country. Obviously they have left the country and come to northern France in order to get on a boat to come here. But they would have to be registered with the UNHCR somewhere outside Iran. The British Iranian Association could say, right, we're going to take 2,000 2,000 of our co-nationals this year. Get the UNHCR to provide us with the 2,000 Iranians who most need to live in a safe Western country.
That's a practical way of implementing what you're describing earlier.
So it's the idea. Sorry, the concept that I was looking for was sponsorship. That is what. We have these. You mentioned them earlier. We have these schemes, but they've been left to rot. Nobody comes through them. And that's partly because so many people have been coming through irregular routes. So the government has had no incentive at all to advertise the fact that you can have community sponsorship. So I don't know. Say
churches have been
an Orthodox community in West London or a Jewish or a Muslim community or whatever, with an attachment to a particular religion or country, can say, we will put up some money, we will find places for people to live, and that deals at a stroke with both the kind of financial anxiety that people have about these large numbers coming, and the integration and security angles. So if you had more sponsorship, either that general sort of individual sponsorship that you had in the case of Homes for Ukraine, or more likely community sponsorship or family sponsorship. Lots of people here who have relations, who are in dire straits somewhere. They could appeal to have them put on the list of people who come here via the safe and legal route. And then again, the costs are kept down, and the integration aspect is dealt with, and the security aspect.
Can I challenge you on the Homes for Ukraine scheme as a reflection of what's really going on? Because with that scheme, and I worked on it, so I saw it in action, we thought that the war was going to last 3 to 6 months. So we thought we were taking just women and children and that it would be a short program and that they would go home afterward. That is completely different, let's say, to the Hong Kong program, which I've also been working on, which was those Hong Kongers, they had no intention of going back to Hong Kong. They are moving here for good. That is an essential, even though you can see it as a kind of, it is certainly a political crisis in Hong Kong. That is an economic migration of sorts. It's a blurring of the two, and I don't think what happened in Ukraine truly reflects the appetite for Brits for immigration.
Look, I'm not. I mean, as I just said, there's the skepticism about large-scale migration, wherever it comes from, whether it's legal or irregular, has gone right back up again. We're in the kind of high 60s of people who think that immigration is too high. And I agree, but we're talking about a sort of subset of the population. We're talking about the Guardian reading classes. Although actually I saw some data on party support among people who were taking the roughly 120,000 people who stepped up to take people. I think it's a bit less than 120,000 actually. And it was kind of reasonably well distributed across the three main parties. It was sort of like nearly 30% of Tories, a bit more Labour and Lib Dem perhaps. So you get the two things are not necessarily in conflict. I mean, I would challenge you slightly on that. I think the Hong Kong story is slightly more complicated than that. I think a lot of people have taken their right to get British residency as a kind of insurance policy. I mean, life in Hong Kong still goes on, and there's a relatively high degree of business freedom. You may not be able to speak your mind politically, but people live there all their lives. They don't necessarily want to leave unless they really have to, unless things get really, really heavy. Obviously, some people will look at, but of that 140,000, I think, I don't know, maybe perhaps a half, 2/3 have come to live here permanently. I think others are kind of yo-yoing a bit or using
certainly
it as
I've
an
known
insurance
some
policy.
who have gone back to Hong Kong, but they're not. I would say of the 140,000, it's a very slim amount of them who are actually fleeing direct persecution from the CCP.
Yeah. And of course, that raises the kind of awkward issue of integration in the fact that, of course, some groups are easier to integrate than other groups. Something that people don't really like to talk about.
Well, let's talk about that and multiculturalism, because that's the thing.
It is an awkward thing. We had what is it? 175,000, 180,000 Ukrainians came over in the blinking of an eye, and 120,000 Brits stepped up to. I mean, that would not be the case with Afghans. I mean, or people from poorer, more traditional parts of the world. And apart from anything else, Afghans tend to have very large families. Mm-hmm. So, if you're talking about, a one Ukrainian woman with a child or two children, it's a very, very different thing from, and also, it's quite likely that Ukrainian woman will speak some, if not quite good English. Compare that with an Afghan family of 4 or 6, much more traditional norms, when it comes to religiosity, relations between men and women. We're talking about huge, huge cultural gulfs.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, that isn't an issue with. No one talks about the Hong Kongers because they just kind of blend in. There may be particular parts of London where there's a disproportionate number of them, but there are no sort of areas of big cities in the way that you get with lots of other minorities in the UK.
With the Hong Kongers, there's a couple of reasons for that. Firstly, is they were wearing, as a Hong Konger, you're sort of wearing two hats anyway. One is a British hat, and one is a Hong Kong hat, which is a mixture. The Hong Kong hat is kind of a half British, half Chinese hat that they're wearing. So it's a country that didn't exist until Britain created it.
Yeah.
And so they have culturally they are sort of half British.
Yeah.
And so their political culture is quite very close to ours, closer to ours than it is to the CCP. But also, of the ones who came over, a lot of them were Christian. A disproportionate amount were Christian compared to.
And they tend to be middle class. They tend to be educated. They speak English sometimes as a first language. I mean, or certainly pretty well or fluent, quasi fluently. Mm-hmm. So obviously, a lot of the normal linguistic or cultural barriers to integration just don't apply in their case. Mm-hmm. So they're not noticed. And indeed, they could be an enormous boost to the British economy. It's something, I don't think the OBR are kind of taking this into account. But if we end up with over the next 2 or 3 years, 250, 300,000 Hong Kongers, who are kind of quietly getting on, opening businesses, raising the sort of educational and entrepreneurial capital of the country. I mean, they might put 0.5% on GDP. Whereas most other forms of irregular migration tend to be the reverse. I mean, they tend to be a drag on it's very hard for the people to contribute significantly economically, so they're dependent on welfare often, and as I say, they come from traditional parts of the world, and they often have very big families. They're consuming more in public services and welfare than they are.
Yes, that's what Suella Braverman said in her speach, is that they don't. Well,
and it's very
hard
for them to. It's very hard for them to contribute. I mean, many of them will do in the longer run. Of course, one of the, we have to also be realistic about the fact that, my idea of having a generic safe and legal route, perhaps alongside some continuing country-specific ones. As I say, all of this is premised on getting the irregular movement largely under control, but when and if that is done, you can start thinking about these safe and legal routes. But one of the problems with the safe and legal route is that if you have the kind of power of God, if you have the power of selection, you tend to take the most vulnerable and the most needy. So even if we're taking 25 or 30,000 people from the UNHCR register, these are people who, on the whole, are not going to be economic contributors, at least for quite a few years. I mean, their children maybe, but they are probably not going to be economic contributors, unlike the young men coming across the channel on the boats, who are, they are, kind of ready and willing to work. Indeed, that's one of the reasons they're coming here, is that they want to they want to live in a wealthy country, and they don't want to be sitting at home on welfare. So it is one of the costs, as it were, of controlling the system, is that in the medium term, the economic costs may actually be slightly higher. But on the other hand, if you've controlled it, then you're not spending £4 billion a year on refugee costs or irregular costs.
Can I ask you a question which is sort of for any progressive listeners that I might have still retained? It's the issue of multiculturalism, and we saw this with Lisa Nanny making a defense of it on Question Time last week. Do you think Angela Merkel said that multiculturalism had failed? David Cameron had said, and yet people are still defending it. Do you think multiculturalism has failed?
It all depends, of course, what you mean by multiculturalism. And that's part of the problem with this debate, is that, and it's interesting that was the part of the Suella Braverman speech that was most picked up on, because much of the rest of it, she was just, as it were, restating government policy or things that she's already said. But it was her reflecting the kind of Merkel-Cameron scepticism. But what she is using multiculturalism, I think, in a sort of more accurate sense than most of her critics. Most of her critics hear the word multiculturalism and they actually hear multi-ethnicity. They hear her criticising the fact that we're a multi-ethnic society. I mean, virtually nobody is saying we can't be a multi-ethnic society or we should reverse it. I mean, it's something like 3% of the population think that you have to be white to be truly British. I mean, that kind of racialized idea of a purely white Britain, is held by a tiny, tiny proportion of the population. Multiculturalism is an idea originally came out of Canada and in the kind of 1950s. It's the idea, and particularly the way it's been applied in the UK, is a kind of, you can come here and be yourself. And it sort of flowed in some ways quite automatically from a kind of almost a colonial mentality. British people had gone out to Africa and India and other parts of the world and had maintained pretty strict sort of racial, ethnic divisions. And when we had the Nationality Act in 1948, which basically provided an open door to everybody in the Empire and Commonwealth, right up until 1962. I mean, that is when most non-white immigration really took off on a large scale in the UK in those early years. Before the door was sort of half shut, although actually non-white immigration continued even at higher levels in some years after 1962. But so that it was that sort of almost sort of colonial assumption that when people came here, I mean, it was a kind of a mixture of sort of common sense and a colonial mentality. The idea that what's the word? There's a technical term for it. That basically, people are more comfortable with people like themselves. Homophily. That you want to live among people who you share a language and culture and way of life with, and that obviously is true, and so there was always going to be a sort of clustering when people came to live here. What I think in retrospect we got wrong is that we were sort of too laissez-faire. We had a kind of laissez-faire, liberal stroke colonial version of multiculturalism, which said, it's fine to come here and live separately so long as you kind of obey the law and pay your taxes. It was this absolutely minimalist notion of multiculturalism. And of course, this is often contrasted with the French approach. I mean, on the ground, there wasn't a huge amount of difference actually between what was happening in Britain and France.
Apart from numbers, but
France had a lot of people coming from its North African colonies in the same era. But they had this rhetoric of integration. We're all French people, and this led to various sort of rather weird things, like they don't really know what the condition of their ethnic minority populations in France, because they're not allowed to collect data but because everybody is just French. Whatever you look like, whatever your religion or background, you are, we're all one under the Marseillaise kind of thing. Now, obviously, that didn't. They have integration problems that are as great, if not greater, than ours. But we didn't. We didn't sort of say to people when they come, yes, come here and be yourself up to a point, but you are now living in Britain and these are the rules, and we would like you to kind of join in the society, and some groups did that and some groups didn't, and or not sufficiently. There are different things one could focus on. I mean, there's the linguistic aspect. I mean, most people, obviously second generation Brits from whatever background, speak English usually as their mother tongue, but there are still some, older women, often from South Asian backgrounds, who tended not to mix in society, so never spoke English well. That was an issue. Just the sort of over concentration of certain groups in certain areas, the big cultural and value divide particularly between devout, religious, perhaps particularly Muslims. They're probably the biggest group in the UK, with very strong religiosity, and often, as I said earlier, with very traditional views about relations between men and women. These things have caused tension. If you look at a place like Leicester. Leicester has become a focus of concern about, a focus of discussion about the multicultural. Is multiculturalism working well or not? I spent quite a lot of time in Leicester while I was writing my British Dream book that you mentioned 10 years ago, and Leicester is both a success and a failure in some ways. I mean, it's a success if you set the bar quite low, and I think this is yet another of the disservices that Enoch Powell and his famous speech did for British politics. He set the bar, so long as the River Thames is not sort of flowing with blood, then we're doing okay. Because Enoch Powell has been proved wrong, there is not great physical violence between different ethnic groups in Britain. Therefore, everything is fine. Well, that is setting the bar ridiculously low. But
there has been some physical violence.
Well, of course,
in
there has
Leicester,
been some. But not between whites and non-whites. On the whole, that's between
Leicester, Sikhs and Muslims.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's what I was going to say. I mean, Leicester. I remember being quite surprised when I went to Leicester. Back in, I was probably there in 2011, 2012, and it was, heralded as a great success story of multiculturalism. And it is a very divided town in the neighbourhoods that, there's a kind of white working class estate, there is a kind of Hindu area, there's a Muslim area, there are Gujaratis, there are different, and there's a small black Caribbean area, I seem to remember. You have, there are some areas, probably the more middle class areas tend to be a bit more mixed. There's an area just outside Leicester that I went to that it's like sort of Hampstead. It's sort of in the semi-countryside. Can't remember the name of it, but it was like full of the Indian heritage consultants who worked at the local hospital, who mixed perfectly happily with the affluent white people who lived in these sort of rural suburbs of the city. But in the city itself, you get these huge divisions, and the fact that nobody ever seemed to think that there was an issue with that, I suppose, is a reflection of the sort of laissez-faire liberal multiculturalism model that we adopted. And you could say it works up to a point. Everybody keeps to themselves, except perhaps in various sort of sub-elites. But a lot of the kind of ordinary people in all of those different groups probably don't mix. Friendship groups won't. No, this may be improving amongst younger generations. But if you go to school in a overwhelmingly white area, or in an overwhelmingly Muslim area, all your friends are going to be that's why actually university often ends up being in those parts of Britain, university ends up being a very important point of integration, because often you won't have met. You come from certain communities, you won't have met or certainly been friends with white people until you get to university, and then you tend to get more mixing. But as you say, the Leicester model was never, I think, in some ways, a very attractive model. It was more or less peaceful, but now, as you say, you've seen this conflict between Hindus and Muslims, or you could cite the recent hoo-ha in Peckham. Angry black mob turns up outside a Asian pharmacist shop. This guy's now in hiding. There are historic tensions between Asians and blacks in many cities. The Asians are often landlords or small shop owners, often very mistrustful of their black customers and so on, and that spilt out in Peckham a few weeks ago. But I think the Leicester the Leicester story, you can look at it through either lens in a way. But I think we could have done better. There could have been a more conscious effort to mix people up. There was actually initially back in the kind of early 60s, there were various sort of British versions of busing, but they proved pretty unpopular as they were in America, so they stopped. But it's because people go to school in the places they live, that you perpetuate those differences often.
But you say we could have done better though. So would you like there to be a change in approach by government to integration? Different standards. Should there be obligations to learn English? Should there be, the extreme example might be Singapore, where they didn't want different groups living in different places, so they integrated it in living
public
where
housing.
You had public housing. Exactly.
Yeah. I think that's sort of too illiberal for us. Every now and then, it used to be the case whenever there was a sort of terrorist attack by British Muslims, there'd be a kind of wave of anxiety. There'd be a new report on integration. There'd be new phrases, parallel lives. It came up in the early 2000s. We had the more recent report when was it, 6 or 7 years ago. And I mean, Trump, it's very difficult to enforce integration in a liberal society. Politicians could perhaps talk about it a bit more. I mean, I think local authorities, I think what you could do is encourage local authorities to encourage more mixed neighbourhoods and mixed schools, and there have been various attempts to do this. You can, data helps here enormously. I mean, if every year or every couple of years you were publishing data on the degree of segregation in different local authorities, the local authorities, wherever it is in Blackburn or Burnley or Oldham or some of these northern towns where there continues to be quite high levels of segregation. If you publish figures on schools and neighbourhoods, the people who are at the bottom of the list, the most segregated. No one wants to be called the most segregated local authority in Britain. So you would encourage, innovative local thinking about this. Now, I mean, it may be that that generational change is helping to deal with some of these things. And of course, as people have become the more successful groups, as they've moved out of their original their sort of areas of residence in London or even in the northern mill towns, they've tended to move into more middle class areas where there is more mixing in schools and places. So affluence can sort of help to time. Also, white British people get more used to, having ethnic minority people in their town or, on the TV or whatever. I mean, and that, so, anyone who's, under 50 in Britain is just, used to, a high degree of sort of multi-ethnicity in their lives. And actually, it's interesting in the Leicester case that one of the kind of, there have been various analyses of the punch-up last year, and a lot of people were saying it was the recent immigrants from India and Pakistan, perhaps. Well, it was the Hindu, Muslim immigrants of kind of recent stock who were behind the conflict. So it was not, the people who have been here for years or perhaps were born here, do know how to get on with each other and with the majority white community, and it was these newcomers who sort of didn't get the rules. But as you were saying earlier, I mean, there are a lot of these newcomers in recent years. So we might well find ourselves with more of these kind of conflicts that we saw in Leicester.
If I can pull you back, because Suella Braverman has asked for thought leaders like yourself to put their minds to the rethinking of the 1951 UN Refugee Convention, which is being abused, she claims, because it's woolly in definitions of, let's say, words like persecution, discrimination. So far, to the extent that when she was challenged in an interview, she said that homosexuality could be abused as a way of you can claim you're escaping persecution because you're gay. And Elton John has pushed back against that, saying it will encourage discrimination against gays in turn. Do you think there needs to be a rewriting of that?
I was slightly surprised that she picked on. I mean, the legal framework in general does make it very difficult to control your borders. I mean, that is the truth. Whether it's the combination of the Refugee Convention and the ECHR, the European Convention on Human Rights, make it very, very difficult to control borders. I'm not sure that the Refugee Convention should be the main target. I mean, I think actually it's much more the European Convention on Human Rights, and particularly the clause that talks about degrading and inhuman treatment, that you should not send anyone back to somewhere where they might be subject to that. But you asked me at the beginning what I thought of the Rwanda scheme, and I never really answered. I mean, I do think, ultimately, you can only stop these movements with agreement of between nations. Like in the case of Australia, they had an agreement to stop boats coming and return them to, was it Papua New Guinea?
Yeah.
We could stop the boats coming over in the blinking of an eye if we had an agreement with the French. And every boat that comes over, we just send back to France. The boats would stop tomorrow. For all sorts of reasons, France won't do that, although it's still possible in the longer run that will be the way that we will stop the boats. It won't be the way we will stop all movement, but it will probably require some sort of agreement with France if the Rwanda scheme doesn't work. Now, the Rwanda scheme, I think, is it offshoring or outsourcing? I always forget. I think we've basically outsourced the whole system to Rwanda, which I think may not be the best way to go. I think there's absolutely nothing wrong in principle with us, as it were, calling people's bluff. If you're coming here because your life is threatened, then
put you in a safe
we
place.
will protect you, but you can't decide where you're going to live. And actually, I'm afraid you're not going to come here. Unless you have a particular reason to. We were talking earlier about family sponsorship and so on. That door ought to be open, but otherwise, we're going to take you to a safe place. And of course, people don't want that because that's not. They want to be in a rich country and they want to, as it were, short circuit the historical process. It's going to take another several generations before their lives, Eritrea or Somalia or wherever, are going to be decent places to live. They're from a better off family. They got the resources. They're gonna hop over here if they can. But there's nothing particularly progressive about that. It's slowing down the changes that ought to be coming in those countries. And so if they come here, we should say, okay, we will keep you safe. And Rwanda, recently anyway, I think has a broadly perfectly good record on that. I'm a little bit...
not historically, but...
Yeah, exactly. But partly because of that historical memory, and they know that the eyes of the world are on them, they actually, I think, have a reasonably good record. And indeed, I think the UNHCR itself has talked about sending refugees to Rwanda. So, Rwanda, because of what happened there, is obviously, somewhat difficult for people to digest. Yeah. But I think we should be controlling the whole processing of people. I think what I'm slightly uneasy about in the case of the Rwanda thing is that we've subcontracted the whole process to them. But of course, if the Rwanda scheme works and they have the capacity, then you create an immediate disincentive. It's like my example of France. As soon as you have an agreement with France and send people back, no one's going to waste $10,000, their family's hard-earned savings, if they're just going to be sent back to where they don't want to be. So the whole point about the Rwanda idea is it's a disincentive. You don't have to. Rwanda doesn't have to be full of 150,000 refugees who wanted to come to Britain. It might have to be full of 5,000, but so long as it's done rigorously, then you dissuade people from making the journey here anyway, not necessarily making the journey full stop. And to dissuade people from making the journey full stop, well, you need some version of I think perhaps call it offshoring rather than outsourcing for the whole of Europe. Europe needs to say anyone who arrives via an irregular method is taken to Ascension Island or wherever, and they're kept there safely in a humane way. And of course, people won't want that because people are coming to enjoy living in a rich country. They're not coming to be safe, or not only to be safe. So there are some sort of offshoring system like Rwanda will probably be adopted, I think, by the alternative. What the famous saying, if liberals are not going to protect national borders, then people will vote for illiberals to do it for them. They won't necessarily be great supporters of the AfD in Germany or the Marine Le Pen or whatever, but they will vote for them if they get sufficiently aggravated by this policy. And And then, if we don't have an ordered way of stopping it, we will have a violent way of stopping it. There's this famous book, this sort of racist dystopian sort of vision that this French guy Jean Raspail had. He wrote a famous book called The Camp of the Saints back in the early 1970s, and it's sort of predicting in some ways what's happening now. There's this enormous boat that I think comes from somewhere in India, in Bengal, and it sort of collects more and more people as it goes around the Cape of Good Hope and up the Atlantic, and it's sort of heading for Marseille. And I mean, it has all this sort of grotesque, racist imagery of the people on the boat, who are coming to destroy Europe. Obviously it's a novel, it's a sort of exaggeration, but I mean, if people get into that sort of Camp of the Saints mindset, then it ends. The book ends with an enormous sort of violent conflagration. So we've politics has got to intervene. I think we've had liberal complacency about this. People say, oh well, migration is impossible to stop. Well, that's not true. We have shown that you can do it. I mean, the EU did it in pushing back when everyone was coming from Turkey. We did a deal with Turkey. Australia has done a deal to stop boats coming. It can be done. Now, obviously, this needs. We need to bribe countries with offers of a lot of money, of legal migration possibilities, from the North African states or whoever it is that we need to sort of control the movement. And of course, we need to help these countries develop. I mean, rich Western countries, spend a lot of money on development aid, and a lot of that money could perhaps be spent more effectively. But we need those countries to get rich quick. I mean, when you get beyond a certain level, the incentive to move declines. It's that sort of in-between state that we're probably in for another 20 or 30 years. I mean, leaving aside the whole question of climate change and whether that's going to affect things or not. But for the next 20 or 30 years, there'll be a lot of countries that have developed up to a point and have quite big middle classes, but are still pretty miserable places to live. And that, if you have the wherewithal, as more people now do, you'll get out. Once they move, if you're either a lot poorer than that, you don't have very many people who can move, or you're a bit richer, and actually it is worth staying. I mean, and we've got to help those countries, I guess, get to the point where they where the kind of bright and ambitious people want to stay.
Well, on that note, David, thank you so much for coming in to speak with me. Congratulations on the anniversary of your book, British Dream. And where can listeners find you?
Well, I live in Hampstead. I work part-time for Policy Exchange, the think tank, and I guess my sort of pub. I mean, I'm on Twitter. I mean, I don't have a Substack or anything, but I can be reached via Twitter.
Wonderful, David Goodhart. Thank you so much for speaking with me.
All right.